continue looking back then at part of what has been said at the January 8th statement as the ANC marks 110 years of its existence. We heard the various messages of support from some of the alliance members and also heard reflections from the president as he delivered the NEC statement. Let me take you now to our guest, Angelo Fick. He's the director at the Auwal Socioeconomic Research Institute. Angelo, good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for your time. 110 years, it's a long time. A lot has happened, and I suppose the opportunity that presents itself is for either good, bad, and a lot of stuff in between. But more specifically today, what kind of reflections and state of the party do you think the ANC is sitting with?
Yes, good afternoon. I think the African National Congress, like any organization that's been around for 110 years, has to reflect on not only its long history, but the challenges it faces in the present. And some of those challenges are outside challenges, the nature of the changing world we live in, and some of those challenges are entirely self-engendered. In other words, internal dynamics of the African National Congress and some of its failures to adapt to the realities of its own existence as well as the world at large over the last 25, 27 years that it has been in political power. And this, I think, has been a particularly challenging time for the party, as it admits in its January 8th statement, and whether or not the solutions that it proffers to address some of those difficulties and challenges, I think remains to be seen. But I have not that much confidence that what the January 8th statement proposes necessarily addresses either those global challenges or the local and specific internal issues that the party faces.
One of the biggest things that the party is sitting now is the existence of contradictions, not just by way of who forms part of its structures at a time where the party wants to speak tough on corruption, but we also heard very tough talk on ill discipline in a weekend and a week that was supposed to be smooth sailing for its party president, Cyril Ramaphosa, but it has not been the case in a province that overwhelmingly at the polls supports the ANC.
So yes, in a province where the African National Congress has a very strong presence politically, whether in the national elections, the general elections, or the local or municipal elections. And so it is tough, I think, for a president of a party that has not had a good showing, which the January 8th statement reflects, at the last elections, to face the kind of, shall we say, ill discipline that it does. But ill discipline is not a new feature in the party. It has featured again and again in January 8th statements and in various statements from the national congresses for a while now. And part of that problem has been the political education that in January 8th statement, one after another, the party says it must address. The state of the branches, which supposedly are the spine of the organization, is part of this problem. We know that auditing the branches has been an issue for the party since at least 2012, 2014, that there have been problems leading up to the 2017 conference around branches, who gets to vote, who gets to go, who is a delegate. And these are not new problems. But whether or not the African National Congress in its current state can address that, and whether or not it can address those issues in the contemporary world in the way that predecessors in leadership have had to deal with crises, Abe Kluma, for example, having to deal with the 1930s crisis, the Youth League of the 1950s having to deal with the party's, what was then seen as its internal inertia. Whether or not the current leadership can do it is not just a test of the quality of that leadership, but of such very different conditions that information and therefore disinformation can spread instantly and can spread so quickly and so widely, is something that we've seen the party grapple with over the last year. The way in which the July riots, which features repeatedly in this January 8th statement, was dealt with, and the party and the party's deployees in government's inability to effectively deal with this disinformation quickly and effectively, I think speaks to some of the larger challenges that lie outside the party's remit, and that the party's adherence to not just the rhetoric, but some of the thinking and methods of the 20th century means that it doesn't really seem well positioned to deal with those challenges effectively.
And Angela, that's part of where the greatest danger lies currently, is that even though you have a party that is consistently speaking about the need to be unified, it only seems to become more fractious. And those divisions in the party are beginning and have for long now manifesting themselves into the state, but also in some instances posing as what can be read as a threat to this country's democracy.
Well, partly the challenges remain internal for the party in terms of inherited troubles from previous party administrations. So the 2015, Congress that couldn't decide how many members the party had, and the distinction between what was declared and what the president said and what the then Deputy Secretary General, the then President Jacob Zuma said in an open forum to the hall of delegates, and what the Deputy Secretary General, J.C. Duarte, then went and defended in the media, that kind of internal distinction, that kind of internal dissent or disagreement or, lack of coherence is something that one can see throughout the party's history since. And slightly before that. But it's also, I think, slightly out of touch with the real challenges of the world. So the climate catastrophe that is unfolding as we speak is a mere backdrop for other issues that it wishes to focus on. It speaks to wanting a specific vision of Africa and speaks to wanting to support the people of, among other places, the Sahrawi Republic, Arab Republic, the Sudan, South Sudan, Libya, and yet it has one note about the issues unfolding in the Kingdom of Eswatini right next door. It wants to have a border management agency that must deal with issues, but its diplomatic and other relations with neighboring states is such that we risk repeating the mistakes we made with Zimbabwe a generation ago. Now with the Kingdom of Eswatini, quiet diplomacy does not work, and this insistence that we will have African solutions to African problems seems to be quite selectively applied. In the local space, there are some contradictions around, this vision of economic development of local government, when in fact local democracy and local civil society organizations, particularly in places like the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, have had to go to court to force the party and its deployees in government to acknowledge that its vision of economic development does not match with their vision of survival. And these kinds of contradictions, I think, speak to a party very much caught in 20th century rhetoric. It continues to use terms like non-sexism and non-racism, when actually, scholarship has shifted us along to anti-racism and anti-sexism. And this, I think, means that it's not just internal challenges. The party has to look to the larger global space in which it operates and begin to realize that it must look sideways and look up. To invoke the metaphor of a recent television film that many people are talking about.
In the absence of that, Angelo, what happens now for the ANC? Because there is an acknowledgement that if nothing drastic is done when it comes to this message of renewal that seems to sound like a broken record these days, but that if that is not taken seriously, the party will continue to be in decline.
Yes, and so it has established this thing as a commission for renewal that will look at a Vision 2032. But this January 8th statement will have to, that commission will have to look at the challenges that lie beyond this January 8th statement, attempting to construct unity in a very, very internally divided organization. The first crisis is, of course, the party's elective conference in December 2022, and whether it can deliver a more decisive leadership, and a more supportive leadership from a more unified organization than it did in 2017. The split down the middle in 2017 cannot be repeated in 2022 without real consequences in 2024. And the party acknowledges that its support in elections, plural, has been in decline, and that this speaks to a sort of decline in support more generally. It wants to have compacts with civil society actors, and people that it identifies as vaguely on the left and in the progressive sector. And in order to do so, it will have to rethink some of its assumptions about this business model that it is proposing for economic renewal and economic growth. It wants to have short-term gains, but it must have its eye on long-term, not just survival of the party, but of the state as a whole and as of the world as a whole. And that, I think, is much more difficult for the party to think through.
Angelo, let's just talk about the president very briefly. Can we trust the president to truly deliver on some of the commitments that have been made in this January 8th statement, where, again, looking at some of the events coming out of this week, this is a party president that has been kept on his toes, sometimes out of actions resulting out of divisions in his own party. How then can we expect that the same individual will be able to translate this message of the ANC into sustainable and viable government policy?
So I think we need to rethink what the president of the African National Congress is able to do and what his role is. This idea that he is some kind of supernumerary prince who simply dictates what goes down the line isn't necessarily true. There are structures and all sorts of mechanisms through the ANC constitution in place by which this vision is engendered not just out of the mind and heart of Cyril Ramaphosa, however well-intentioned he may be as an individual, but through the leadership structure elected in 2017. Now, that's not just the top 6 officials, but the various other structures that are in place. And so all of those regional councils, provincial executive committees, all of those structures inform the way in which the president can and cannot function. The NEC itself is an organization that makes the kind of, or a structure that makes the kind of decisions that the organization has to live by. And here I think it's important to recognize that when we pin something on Cyril Ramaphosa with a name, what we're really doing is pinning it on the administration of the ANC in this particular period. And therefore his leadership, important as it is a leadership that must be, as the document itself says, work by democratic consensus or democratic centralism, central democratic consensus. And here I think the failure is going to be the organizations, and they may wish to pin it on one man, but it isn't just one man that has brought the party to this particular juncture. It isn't Jacob Zuma that caused the crisis, it is the party itself. And here I think this resort to individuals to explain what happens in organizations might be convenient for storytelling for many of us, but it actually doesn't explain the way in which organizations actually function. Because if that was the way in which organizations function, then it doesn't explain why Jacob Zuma isn't still the president or wasn't still the president after 2018. Of party and country, and it wouldn't explain some of the crises that have been engendered under Ramaphosa's big promise of a new dawn.
Angelo, there have been many people, commentators in particular, who have been speaking about the pending implosion of the ANC. I wonder if you're one of those that sees a ticking time bomb, and if so, what would your timelines look like?
I don't have a crystal ball, but I do know that the wheel of history turns only forward, and an organization that has survived for 110 years cannot survive in perpetuity. There simply is and has to be a future in South Africa and in the world beyond the ANC. And the electorate has indicated that it is beginning to conceive of that future without the party. The people in the party must begin to conceive of the future in this country and in the world without it. And that, I think, is very difficult. Hence this Vision 2032. The Vision 2032 seems wholly focused on the ANC as maintaining some position of prominence in the world. And the speed at which events in the world unfold does not imply that that is a certainty that they should necessarily have. It is difficult for many of us in this moment to imagine 2032 without the ANC, but it is important for us to be able to do so and to be able to imagine a functioning state without any of the political players in the current landscape. And our survival as a species, not just in this country but on this planet, may depend on our ability to think of new structures, new ways, new methods. And some of the African National Congress Party line, some of the language, some of the terms, and some of the conceptions of what the challenges are that will face people who are now under 25 in the second half of this decade, never mind the second half of the century, are simply just, the ideas of old men from the 1980s who haven't kept touch with the science of the 21st century. It says, for example, in the statement that on the protocols around the pandemic, it will follow the science. Why does it not have the same approach to the other problems that face us as a planet and as a species? The climate catastrophe isn't some negligible footnote. We may become the footnote of our own existence if we don't pay attention to it. And this January 8th statement simply doesn't. It speaks very much in terms of a market economy, in terms of economic development, in terms of the kind of 1960s social science that really has been proven not just to be empty, but it's the equivalent of a chemistry honors student wanting to talk about phlogiston in a seminar. It really is. You sort of go, what is this person doing?
Angelo Fick, we're going to have to leave it there for today. He is the director as ASRI, and as you heard, there are certainly reflections of a party that might not necessarily be fit for purpose, as they often like to say. We'll take